What years? What is the year that you finished
2009.
Stanford?
Well,
Yeah.
this was another sliding doors moment where a very well-known investor called Vinod Khosla had come to Stanford to give a talk, and I really liked. And it's funny because he was actually in his previous firm, Kleiner Perkins, was an investor in Tell Me, where I had worked for many years, and I really liked his talk. And so on his way out, I just stalked him for a business card and dropped him an email. And it's funny because, and then I just went through this process of interviewing with him that took like 3 or 4 months, where I'd go just spend time at the office. He would ask me the most interesting questions and then have me think about them for 2 weeks and come back and answer them. I remember one of the questions he asked me is, would you buy a newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicles, which was the biggest newspaper in the Bay Area at the time? He asked, would you buy it for a penny if you could? And it's funny because obviously newspapers were in decline because of online
Yeah.
media, but it wasn't as
Yeah.
obvious as it is today. And then after 3 months, and then after 3 months, I was very fortunate enough to get the job, and then I joined Khosla Ventures as the first principal, and that was my foray into the venture capital. So I had a somewhat, I think, maybe different transition than most, where a lot of folks are founders and they become investors. I was sort of
Yeah.
an engineer, and then I was an investor, and I really enjoyed being an investor. But then in 2011, something very interesting happened, which is obviously the Arab Spring. And at the time, I
Yeah.
had been an investor for 2 years. I was investing in companies um, in the US. I was on a number of boards. But when the Arab Spring happened, one thing that really, first of all, it had obvious two effects. One is uh, it made us all excited about doing something different and innovative and new. I had friends who were taking huge risks in Egypt, and I was here in a very safe job because starting a company might be too risky. And so it was sort of a drive for many of us to think about sort of our life's purpose in a sense. But the other sort of thing, the idea that I saw from the Arab Spring is the role of social media. I think it's often lost that this was truly the first sort of online organization of a mass protest in history, and even reflect about what happened then. If you remember the very first time, Magnus Laskari issued
A press release.
a press release. They put it on Facebook. It's
Yeah.
kind of mind-blowing. Like
Yeah.
Egypt
Yeah.
really pioneered the use of social
Yeah.
media by
For
government.
sure.
This
For
never
sure.
happened anywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
And what hit me is how inefficient a lot of there was really no platform here for sharing great articles or great content about interesting topics. People were doing it on Facebook, but Facebook wasn't really built for that. And so I decided to actually start, quit my job and start a company. And that's the impetus behind Snippet, which was a social media place that allows you to share articles around topics of interest, articles and videos around topics of interest.
And did you do that from the US or did you come back to Egypt at that time?
No, I sit in the US. I sit in the
You
US, and
stayed
it
in the
was
US.
mainly it was getting a lot of inspiration from what was happening in Egyptian use of social media, but the platform was mainly used by both Americans and by some people in the Middle East as well.
Yeah. And you're clearly someone who likes risk and cherishes and relishes risk. It's and I think also partly it was your age at the time, you were young and you were trying different things. I mean, to start a job, to leave a job because you want to try something else, that's pretty, that's really unusual. I think most people, when they find themselves in a good setup, kind of cling to it and think, okay, now I'm all set. Now I will, settle down or enjoy it or whatever. But they don't necessarily think of, jumping ship again so quickly. But you've done that several times, especially at the beginning of your career. Is risk a major attraction for you? Is that something you're always looking for, or is it like a subconscious thing that's like, your baseline is risk?
It's funny you say that, Malak, because my perception is actually very different. If there's, I don't subscribe to regretting, but if there's one thing I regret is not taking enough risks in life. And I
Wow.
think I feel I actually have so often took the safest. There was an element of risk to it, but it was also sort of there was, there was no real downside
It's
to many
calculated
of
risk.
these
It's a
steps.
calculated move.
It's it's calculated risk, and I've seen founders across my career uh, who are truly are risk takers, and they are willing to take risks at way more frequency than I do. And I think, and they're willing to sort of convince themselves of things that are not true, but then in the process they become true. Uh, and
Well,
then,
here's another
it's
way
funny.
to
I was
look at it. Here's another way to look at it. Are you as risk, you know, conscious or savvy now that you have a family than you were then when you were single and you had no commitments, no responsibility? Or are you now a little bit more conservative?
um, I think I have gotten. Um, I do think I've gotten more conservative a little bit with time,
Yeah,
uh, but also more appreciative of risk taking at the same time. Right,
yeah,
I became
yeah,
more
yeah.
aware, more conscious uh, of risk, and I also think
Hmm.
um, I've become more aware of the importance of psychology in managing it all.
In what
It's funny.
sense?
My parents are visiting, and so my mom was binging on Musalsalat Ramadan last night, and I was, I literally just sat next to her working on my laptop, and and during one of the episodes, there's just like, actually, I find the scenarios sometimes really really well written. I was watching, this very very profound. And there was just two guys talking to each other in a hara, and one told the other person, اللي صدق نفسه تصدق الدنيا. And I was like, oh, that is so profound. That is actually exactly the essence of entrepreneurship, right? It's
Yeah.
having that conviction about things, and then sort of turning the wheel of of the arc narrative of history to sort of your own vision of the future and
Mm,
what you want to
mm,
accomplish. And I think some of the best founders I have met, they almost have a loose cannon in their brain,
mm.
where their assessment of risk is a little bit off, and that's precisely why they succeed.
Yeah. I also think that fundamentally the people who are, from what I can see as an outsider, the people who seem to be the most successful, in terms of reaching the heights in their industries, tend to be the ones, especially in tech, who have a base of nerdy engineering, who are not just money guys or investors. Or I feel that if you have a base where there is a profound understanding of the tools of your trade, you make those choices that appear risky to the outsider, but are actually very well understood by you, because you understand the underlying foundation of what you're buying or investing in, or that people from the outside may not appreciate as much. It's just an observation.
No, I think that's very valid, and it's very
Yeah,
correct.
yeah, yeah. So what happened with Snippet? So that didn't last very long, right? You didn't
No,
continue with that for too long.
no, I did that for 2 years, and we were very popular as a social media tool, and grew with, to probably had millions of snips of posts that have taken place, tens of thousands of active users posting left and right on it. But then in 2012, two things happened. First, Facebook IPO'd, and then its stock crashed. And when that happened, the appetite for investing in social media really, really dropped. And so investors, VCs, sort of got a little scared of investing in more social media. And then Yahoo came out of nowhere and made us Marissa Mayer had just became CEO of Yahoo, and she really wanted to make Yahoo more social. And so they reached out to us about buying the company to become sort of the sort of a core component of making Yahoo a lot more social and more interactive, because it's what we were doing, is social interactive content. And so that was probably uh, one of the things. If I was a little bit more risk taking, I would have probably kept going with the startup instead of selling it.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I saw that opportunity, and I ended up going with the acquisition.
With that sale,
And
yeah.
candidly, it is very hard to monetize highbrow content. Like at the time, it was us
Tell me about
and
it. I'm
Pinterest, and
trying. I'm trying, Ramy. I'm trying.
yeah,
It's not
exactly,
easy.
exactly. It's very hard. Like it's a lot easier to monetize nail art, which was very, very popular and exploding on Pinterest at the time, like than it is to. And so I think the sort of economic realities of content and media were I was sort of learning more and more about them,
Yeah.
and it really and I think my naivete about the role of media was being put in check.
Yeah. Yeah. So presumably you found yourself unemployed after that? You were at a
No,
in
no, 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 no,
between,
no. Yahoo acquired the Snippet and asked me to be to run media, a big part of it with the team. So I
but
ran
did you
media.
stay? You stayed on and did
I
that
stayed at
then?
Yahoo for 2 years. There were golden
Ah,
handcuffs that
okay.
made it hard to leave, but I stayed for a
Right,
couple of
right.
years.
And
I stayed for 2 years.
why did you move on from there? You found that that
No,
was not
no, that was definitely I don't I mentioned earlier I wish I definitely it was way too boring and way too stable for me. So
yeah,
maybe you're
yeah.
right. Maybe I do like taking a little bit of
Yeah,
risk after all.
there's a risk thing going on here. I'm noticing a pattern, Ramy. There's definitely a pattern. So what happened next for you?
Um, well, what happened next for me is this was the first time where I did not have a job. So if just think about it. I left Egypt in 1994. This is all the way to 2016, 22 years, where I always had something to do. I always had a very clear next step. I never left something without knowing what my next destination was going to be. And whether it was finishing college, I had gotten a job for my startup, or whether I left, as I mentioned, I left Microsoft after the choir told me to go to business school. I got a job out of business school. I left that job to start a company, but there was always a clear destination. Um, and I'd always ran to something. This was the first time in my career where I just ran away from something and not to anything.
I find it interesting that you found. Did you tell me how you felt about having this sort of quiet time? Was it exciting for you, or was it nerve-wracking that you had suddenly nothing to do?
Candidly, it was nerve wracking.
It was nerve-wracking.
It
Yeah.
it was nerve wracking, and part of it is, and it was a great glimpse into what it's a privilege to have that in life by choice, right? Many people are forced to be laid off, or people work their entire career and then retire at 62 and realize that they're depressed and don't know
Sure,
why,
sure, sure.
because their life was defined by their career. And so it was and I also didn't have a family at the time, which would have been at least a foundation or a time
Of
suck,
course. Of
regardless of how
course.
you phrase it.
Sure,
And
sure.
so it was certainly tumultuous. It was very
And and
tumultuous.
and what did you do with your time? Did you were you productive? Did you learn a language? Did you pick up a new hobby? Did you panic? Did you start to panic about what your future was? I mean, what was it like? Tell me what happened to you that year?
All the above. I I worked with a founder on a startup. I almost, I interviewed for a couple of jobs and got the jobs, but didn't take the jobs. I that job one job was like in the U.S. One was to run a business in Asia. Um, I
So you were confused. You went through a confused
I was
phase.
very I went through a very confused phase for a few months, but then at the end of the day, there was a silver lining, right? I loved
Yeah.
startups,
Yeah.
and I had been in I you know and I had been starting to invest in startups and help startups and advise startups, and that was emerging as probably the right it's
Hmm.
sort of the trajectory of my entire life was working with
Yeah.
startups. I was just not sure whether do I start one, do I invest in one. There was a couple of VC firms that wanted me to join, but I felt like it was just going to be again like Coleslaw, where it's a firm, and we're coming later investing, and what really also candidly what I love is a 0 to 1. I
Yeah.
really love having just working, whether I do it myself or work with someone else to do it, but I really love getting um, the glimpse of an idea or the kernel of an idea and trying to make it into some form of reality. The idea of a product and then shipping that product and getting in front of the user. And so I think that 0 to 1 was what I loved most. And that's really the story behind where I eventually, where I ended up after that
Mm.
year, which is starting 1984 Ventures.